I know how this is going to sound. I'm a field biologist with 12 years of wilderness research. I've published in peer-reviewed journals. I don't believe in things I can't measure. And I'm telling you that I spent 4 months living inside a hidden settlement of an unclassified hominid species in the Ozark Mountains. That one of them kept my field notebook for 6 months and then handed it back to me at the edge of their territory, and that I have spent 5 years since then deciding what to do about it. I have no photographs, no recordings, no physical evidence beyond a scar on my right palm and a bracelet made from creek grass that's slowly falling apart in the inside pocket of a jacket I can't bring myself to put in storage. They destroyed everything else on the first night, systematically, deliberately, in a way that made it absolutely clear they had done it before. I'm not here to convince you. I stopped needing to convince people a long time ago. I'm here because the notebook is still in a fireproof box in my office, and every year I open it, and every year I close it, and I think I'm finally ready to tell someone why. The coffee was still hot when I pulled off Highway 7 into the gravel lot outside the ranger station, which felt like a small miracle after 4 hours of driving through the Arkansas pre-dawn. I'd made it myself in the motel room, bad instant stuff from a foil packet, poured into a thermos I'd been carrying since my grad school days. The thermos had a dent on the left side from a drop in the Cascades and a faded sticker on the bottom that said, "Property of UMass Biology Department." Neither the department nor the sticker's original owner had ever asked for it back. I figured that made it mine. The station wasn't open yet, which was fine. I didn't need anyone to check me in or wish me luck, or remind me about bear protocols I'd memorized before most of the rangers here had graduated high school. I was doing a 3-week solo wildlife survey in the upper Ozark wilderness for a paper I'd been circling for 2 years. A behavioral ecology study on white-tailed deer migration corridors in high-elevation mixed hardwood zones. Unglamorous work. Exactly the kind of work I preferred. No grant committees breathing down my neck, no graduate students to manage. Just me and my equipment, and the particular silence that only exists in forests before the birds wake up. I laced up my boots on the tailgate of my truck, checked my pack one more time out of habit rather than necessity. Trail camera units, data notebook, GPS, satellite communicator, collapsible water filter, 3 weeks of freeze-dried food portioned into labeled bags, first aid kit, my father's old hunting knife in a sheath on my hip. Everything accounted for. I shouldered the pack, locked the truck, and started up the trailhead. The Ozarks in early October are a different world than the Ozarks of summer. The humidity drops, and the air gets this clean, mineral quality to it, like breathing through cold stone. The canopy goes from dense green shadow to something more open and amber, light filtering through turning leaves in long, angled shafts. I'd worked this region twice before, both times in summer, and I'd liked it well enough. But I hadn't worked this particular section of the upper range, the area marked on USGS maps as Hollow Fork Wilderness, a designation that meant no maintained trails, no road access, and almost no documented visitor traffic in the past decade. That last part is why I'd chosen it. Deer populations in genuinely undisturbed zones behaved differently than deer in areas with regular human presence, and I needed the comparison data. The first mile was everything I'd hoped for. Leaf litter thick and soft underfoot, the occasional rustle of something small in the underbrush, a red-tailed hawk riding a thermal above the ridgeline to the east. I startled a group of turkeys near a creek crossing, and they scattered up the slope with their usual indignant alarm, crashing through the brush like they were personally offended by my existence. I wrote the encounter in my field notebook, time-stamped it, estimated the group size at 7. Normal. Everything exactly as it should be. I made camp that first evening in a shallow bowl between two ridges, a spot the topographic map suggested would have decent wind protection and proximity to water. The creek was there, just as the map promised, running cold and clear over flat limestone shelves. I set up my tent, hung my food bag, started a small fire for the psychological comfort more than the warmth. The temperature was dropping faster than I'd expected, probably into the low 40s by midnight, but my sleeping bag was rated for lower than that. I ate my dinner watching the fire and writing up the day's preliminary observations in my notebook, and I felt, genuinely, like everything was exactly right. This was what I was built for. This specific configuration of solitude and purpose. I was almost asleep when I noticed it, or rather, noticed the absence of it. I'd been lying in my tent, listening to the ordinary sounds of a forest at night for maybe half an hour. The creek, the wind moving through the upper canopy, the occasional distant call of an owl working the ridge above me. And then, sometime around 11, those sounds simply stopped. Not gradually, the way a forest quiets when a predator passes through, where you can track the silence as it radiates outward from a moving center. All at once, completely, like someone had turned a dial. The creek was still running, the wind was still moving, but nothing was calling, nothing was moving in the brush, nothing was existing in that forest except me, and whatever had made everything else decide, in unison, to go silent. I lay there for a long time with my eyes open in the dark, telling myself it meant nothing. By the third day, I had placed 11 trail cameras across a grid covering roughly 4 square miles of the upper hollow. The work was methodical and satisfying in the way that only field setup work can be, when you're moving your body through difficult terrain with a clear purpose, and each completed task represents a small, concrete victory. The terrain was harder than the map had suggested, steeper and more broken, full of hidden limestone drops and dense stands of cedar that forced constant route adjustments. My legs were burning by noon each day, and I was sleeping deeply, dreamlessly, which I took as a sign that I was working at the right level of physical difficulty. What I wasn't getting was wildlife. By the end of day 3, I had spotted exactly 2 deer, both distant, both moving away from me at speed, both behaving in ways that suggested prior disturbance rather than encountering me fresh. The camera checks on day 4 yielded almost nothing. One camera had captured a single image of what might have been a coyote at the extreme edge of the frame, blurred and ambiguous. Another had captured a possum at 2 in the morning, which I recorded dutifully and without enthusiasm. For a supposedly undisturbed wilderness zone, the place felt emptied out. Not naturally sparse the way some forest interiors can be, where the habitat simply doesn't support high ungulate density, but specifically absent, as if the animals that should have been there had received some signal I hadn't and acted on it. On the morning of day 5, I found the first arrangement. I was working my way up a drainage toward the highest camera position when I came across a section of hillside where a group of young cedars had been bent and woven together at roughly 8 feet off the ground, their flexible upper trunks threaded through each other in an interlocking pattern that created a kind of arch over the slope. It was the kind of formation that a strong storm with unusual wind patterns might theoretically produce, if you were inclined to accept unlikely explanations, which my training generally required me to at least consider. But the weaving was too consistent, too regular, and crucially, the trees showed no signs of lateral stress at their bases, which you'd expect to see if wind had forced them into those shapes. They had been bent while still young and flexible, and then held in place long enough for the wood to set in those positions. This had been made deliberately. It had been made carefully. And it had been made a long time ago, possibly years. I photographed it thoroughly and wrote 3 pages of observations in my notebook, and then I walked away from it at a pace that was only slightly faster than my normal pace, telling myself I was adjusting my route to check the upper camera position before the light changed. The second anomaly was the following morning. I'd placed a camera near a limestone overhang that I'd identified as a likely deer bedding site, and when I pulled the memory card and ran through the overnight captures, I found 9 hours of empty hillside, followed by a single frame at 3:47 a.m. that showed very clearly a hand, not a paw, a hand. 5 fingers, proportionally arranged, the thumb offset at an angle consistent with an opposable grip. The hand was reaching toward the camera from the left side of the frame, partially out of focus, but undeniably what it was. Then the next frame, shot 30 seconds later by the motion trigger, showed nothing. Whatever had been reaching toward the camera had either moved out of frame or understood that the camera would fire again and chosen not to be captured. I stood in the cold morning light looking at that image on the camera's small screen for a very long time. Then I took a screenshot, put the card back, and kept working. The third anomaly I didn't find so much as experience. I was eating lunch on a flat rock above a creek bend, maybe 500 meters from my camp, when I became aware that I was being watched. I want to be precise about this because the sensation gets described loosely in accounts I've read, and the looseness bothers me professionally. This was not a vague feeling of unease. This was a specific, directional awareness of sustained attention being directed at me from the tree line to my northeast, roughly 80 meters distant. The kind of certainty that takes years of solo fieldwork to calibrate, but, once calibrated, is rarely wrong. Prey animals operate on this sense constantly. I had learned to operate on it also. I did not look directly at the tree line. I finished my lunch, made a note in my field book, packed my bag at a normal pace, and walked back toward camp on my usual route. And for the entire duration of that walk, I felt the attention follow me, tracking my movement with a patience and steadiness that no casual forest animal would maintain. That night, I moved my tent 20 meters from its original position, without entirely knowing why. I woke at 4 in the morning to silence so complete it felt structural, like the silence was holding something up. My instincts were already running before my conscious mind caught up. That field-trained alarm system that registers wrongness before it can articulate what's wrong. I lay still and listened. The creek, the wind, nothing else. I unzipped my tent slowly and looked out. My equipment cache, the dry box I'd secured between 2 trees with a bungee cord, was gone. Not fallen, not knocked over. Gone. The bungee cord was still in place between the 2 trees, still taut, still hooked at both ends. But whatever it had been wrapped around had been removed so cleanly that the cord hadn't moved. I found the dry box 12 meters away, set down in a small clearing with precise deliberateness. Every item removed and arranged in a rough grid on the ground around it. Trail camera units, battery packs, memory card cases, my data notebook, my first aid kit, my spare GPS batteries. Arranged by approximate size, largest items farthest from the box, smallest, closest. Not scattered, not damaged, not stolen. Organized. Examined and put back down in a way that communicated very clearly that they had been examined. My satellite communicator was in the center of the grid. Smashed. Not stepped on, not dropped, struck with something heavy and flat, multiple times, until the casing had split open and the internal components had been exposed, and then those components had been struck separately. It was thorough work, methodical. The device was beyond any repair. My main GPS unit was beside it, also smashed. The only items missing entirely were both spare batteries for my trail cameras, which seemed like a strange choice until I considered that both batteries were the same size and shape as a rock of approximately the same weight and would have required closer examination to identify as technological rather than natural objects. Whatever had sorted through my equipment had made distinctions. It had separated the items that could record or transmit or navigate from the items that couldn't. And it had destroyed the former category and left the latter. I sat down on the cold ground next to the arrangement and looked at it for a long time. The eastern sky was starting to pale slightly, the black overhead softening toward a very dark blue. My hands were shaking, which I noted with clinical detachment as a physiological stress response, appropriate to circumstances. I was a professional in a compromised position. I needed to inventory my remaining capabilities and make a rational decision about what to do next. My rational decision was to follow the tracks. They weren't trying to hide them. That was the first thing I noticed. Whatever had been in my camp had walked in from the north on two legs, moved through my campsite with apparent ease, and walked back out to the northwest on the same two legs, leaving clear impressions in the soft soil near the creek bank. The prints were large, much larger than any human foot, with 5 clear toe impressions and a defined heel and arch. The stride length was enormous. Whatever had made these prints was not moving carefully or trying to conceal its passage. It had come, done what it intended to do, and left. It had wanted me to see the tracks. I was as certain of this as I'd been certain of being watched from the tree line. I followed them for 6 hours. The ravine that opened in front of me wasn't on any map I had. I'd checked 3 times, first with my paper topo, then with the memory of my GPS display before it was destroyed, then with my own spatial memory of the terrain I'd been covering for 5 days. The ravine cut through a section of hillside that every map I'd consulted showed as unbroken slope, a geological feature that had somehow been left out of every survey. The walls were limestone, old and moss-covered, streaked green and gray, closing to maybe 4 feet at the narrowest point, so I had to turn sideways and push through. The tracks continued through the wet gravel of the ravine floor, with complete indifference to my difficulty navigating the space. When the ravine opened into the valley, I stopped walking and stood there for what was probably several minutes without moving. The structures were the first thing that registered. Not the scale of the valley, or the quality of the light, or the sound of the stream running through the center, but the structures, because my brain went directly to them and refused to move on. Domed shapes built from bent saplings and bark and gray mud plaster, ranging in size from small outbuildings no taller than my chest, to structures with entrances that would require something very large to pass through comfortably. They were distributed across a hillside that caught the afternoon light, connected by paths worn smooth by long use. There was a central clearing with a fire ring lined with flat river stones, ringed by log sections arranged in a deliberate circle. Racks of something dark and dried, meat probably, hung between posts. Tools leaning against an outer wall, shapes I could identify and shapes I couldn't. I walked into the settlement like the complete fool I was. I was in the center of the clearing, turning slowly, trying to absorb everything, when they appeared. There is no better word. They did not walk out of the forest or emerge from their structures. They were absent, and then they were present. 6 of them, forming a loose circle that had closed off every exit from the clearing before I'd registered they were moving. I spun and found myself looking up at a wall of bodies that my mind refused to categorize quickly enough. Large, very large, the smallest of them 6 inches over my head at minimum, the largest nearly 3 feet taller than that. Covered in fur that ranged from dark brown to a near black, thick and coarse-looking, longer around the head and shoulders. Their faces were the worst part to process, not because they were monstrous, but because they weren't. Because my pattern recognition was trying to file them under a category that didn't exist. Somewhere between the primate faces I'd spent my career studying, and something that had no analog in my experience. One of them was different. It stood slightly back from the others, to my left, and it was watching me with an intensity that was distinct from the wary, threat-assessing attention of the rest. Its fur was lighter than the others, a gray-brown that made it stand out against the darker members of the group. Its arms were long, even by the standard of the others around it, hanging to mid-thigh when relaxed, and it kept tilting its head at precise intervals as it watched me. Left, then center, then left again. A behavioral pattern I'd have called systematic observation if I'd been looking at a chimpanzee. It wasn't afraid of me. It was interested in me the way I was, under other circumstances, interested in things I hadn't seen before. They took my pack. They went through it with careful hands, passing items between themselves, examining each one. My remaining trail camera units were destroyed first. Then my phone. Then my spare compass. They left my food, my first aid kit, my knife, my clothing. The distinction they made, again, between the technological and the non-technological was too consistent to be accidental. They had a category for these things. They had seen them before. The gray one watched me the entire time. When the others gestured me toward one of the medium structures, and I complied because I had no realistic alternative, the gray one followed at a slight distance, stopping outside the entrance while 2 others took up positions on either side. It looked at me for a long moment before I ducked inside. Then it looked at the entrance of the structure. Then back at me. The head tilt again. Left. Center. Left. I thought at the time that I was being imprisoned. I understand now that I was being enrolled. The gray one, who I eventually named Rufus in my head because I needed to name him, and because there was something in his coloring and his deliberate manner that called to mind a gray-muzzled old dog I'd had as a kid, was different from the others in ways that became clearer over the first 2 weeks of my captivity. The others interacted with me according to what seemed like established protocols. Bring food, indicate boundaries, respond to violations with immediate and proportionate correction. Clear, consistent, understandable in its logic, even if not in its details. Rufus operated on a different agenda entirely. He would sit outside my shelter for hours at a time, not guarding it the way the rotating sentries did, but positioned at an angle where he could observe me through the gap in the entrance while I observed him back. He would bring me things, not food, but objects. A piece of chert with an unusually clean fracture face, the kind that would make a good tool blank. A bird's nest, perfectly intact, that he'd apparently carried here without disturbing the internal structure. A long bone, probably deer, with marks on it that I couldn't identify as either tool use or feeding damage, and which I turned over in my hands for so long trying to classify them, that when I looked up, Rufus had moved 6 feet closer without my noticing, watching my hands with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a technique. I started leaving things for him to examine in return. Not a calculated strategy at first, more a reflexive attempt to reciprocate the gesture. I'd arrange small objects near the entrance in the morning before the settlement woke up fully. Pebbles sorted by color, sticks arranged in geometric patterns. He would examine these arrangements carefully, dismantle them, rearrange them, and leave them for me to find. When I reproduced his rearrangements exactly, he tilted his head and made a low sound I'd never heard from any of the others, a kind of extended exhalation through closed lips that vibrated at the back of the throat. I heard it enough times, always in contexts of completed exchange or successful communication, that I started interpreting it as satisfaction. My days settled into a rhythm structured by the community's rhythms, which were consistent enough that I could have set a clock by them. Hunters left at first light in groups of 3 or 4, returning in the late afternoon. Gatherers worked in slower-moving groups, the older females and the juveniles, ranging the valley floor and lower slopes. The elder male, massively built with a bearing of authority that needed no translation, moved through the settlement like a slow weather system, people adjusting their behavior around his trajectory without appearing to consciously notice they were doing it. There was a female with authority of a different kind, smaller than the males, but treated with a deference that seemed more chosen than enforced, who I watched resolve 3 separate conflicts during my first week, simply by placing herself between the parties and making a low sound until both parties looked at her. I was given tasks when it became clear I was going to be there for a while, and that idleness was not a concept the community had a place for. Firewood was the first assignment, delivered through gestures of such clarity that I couldn't pretend to misunderstand. Fish cleaning came next, brutal work with a poorly flaked stone scraper that cut my hands badly before I learned the correct angle of approach. Then I was allowed to help with shelter maintenance, repacking mud into cracked walls. And here, Rufus appeared regularly and watched my technique with the same systematic attention he applied to everything I did, occasionally demonstrating a more efficient approach with his own hands, and then watching while I reproduced it. The tilted head exhalation when I got it right. The turning point arrived in the 5th week. A juvenile, a young male, if I was reading the social dynamics correctly, had climbed a large oak at the valley's eastern edge to a height of maybe 40 feet, showing off in the way that young males across species show off when they want an audience. Big, confident movements, pauses to check if anyone was watching. I was watching. I saw the branch he was moving toward, and saw the way it flexed under the approach of his weight, and knew, with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of watching how things break, that it was going to give. I shouted, which was useless, and which I knew was useless. But the shout was involuntary. The branch cracked, and the juvenile dropped and hit the ground with a sound I felt in my sternum. Everyone converged immediately. The juvenile was screaming, a sound completely unlike any adult vocalization I'd heard from them, higher and more continuous, and the adults around him were making sounds I also hadn't heard, lower and urgent, and nobody was doing anything useful, because there was nothing in their toolkit for this. The leg was broken, visibly, badly. I pushed through the crowd. I don't know what I expected them to do. They let me through, which surprised me enough that I nearly stopped. The juvenile looked up at me from the ground with an expression that required no translation at all, and I put everything else out of my head and worked. The mother, I was certain she was the mother from the way she moved and the sounds she was making, held her child still while I set the splint. She watched my hands the entire time with an expression I'd have called terror adjacent if I'd seen it on a human face. But she didn't interfere, which required more self-control than I'd have been capable of in her position. When I finished and showed her how to check the bind with 2 fingers to make sure it wasn't too tight, she looked at my hands, then at the splint, then at my face. Then she pulled me against her chest with both arms, and I was briefly and completely enveloped by warmth and the overwhelming smell of smoke and animal musk, and something else, something underneath, that my brain filed without any rational justification as safety. After that, The settlement treated me differently. The guards outside my shelter disappeared. The perimeter that had existed around my movements in the settlement softened to nothing. People made eye contact with me. Rufus, whose observational distance had always been respectful, started sitting beside me rather than across from me. 2 months in, he showed me something I hadn't been allowed near before. The eastern edge of the valley, past a dense stand of pawpaw trees, held a field of low mounds. Older ones covered in moss, their shapes softened by time, barely distinguishable from natural ground variation. Newer ones, with objects on them, pieces of worked wood, stones, feathers, woven grass objects. Rufus walked me through this space slowly, and I understood without any gesture being required that he was not explaining it to me so much as including me in it, showing me that this place existed, and that its existence meant something. We stood at the newest mound for a long time. He made no sound. I made no sound. Eventually, he placed his hand on my shoulder briefly, and then moved away, and I stood there, alone among the mounds for a while longer, because it seemed like the right thing to do. They told me they were leaving in early spring, 2 weeks after a hunting party returned to the settlement in a state of controlled alarm that I had learned by then to read accurately. The elder male explained it to me in the clearing in front of his shelter, using drawn diagrams and gesture sequences I'd become competent enough in to follow most of. Humans, closer than before. The valley's secrecy had developed a crack. The only rational response was to move, to go deeper, to find another place. They had done this before. I understood that. This settlement, these structures, this carefully maintained life, had all been built in other valleys before this one, and would be built in other valleys after. They gave me a choice in the same medium, gesture and diagram, simple and direct. Come or go. I sat in the clearing for a long time after the elder male went back inside. Rufus sat with me. He didn't try to influence the outcome. He sat beside me and looked at the same middle distance I was looking at, and seemed to understand, perhaps better than I did, what I was working through. I thought about what waited for me on the other side of the ridge. Not my job, which would have filled my position by now. Not my lease, which would have lapsed. Not the paper I'd been planning to write, which felt so distant from where I was sitting that I could barely remember its original premise. I thought about coffee, about books, about the particular quality of silence in my apartment at 2 a.m, when I couldn't sleep, and the city outside was as quiet as it ever got, which was not quiet at all, but mine. I thought about my sister, who was 12 years younger than me, and who I hadn't called in 3 months before I came out here, and who had almost certainly spent these months imagining the worst, and about what it would do to her if I chose not to come back. I told Rufus I was leaving. Or rather, I indicated it, the gesture sequence I developed for departure, index finger pointing to my own chest, then sweeping outward toward the ravine. He looked at the gesture. Then he looked at my face for a long moment. Then the exhalation, low and long, more sustained than I'd heard it before. He walked me out himself. The mother of the juvenile brought her son to the edge of the valley to see me off, the young male walking now with a slight rolling gait that would probably be permanent, but that caused him no apparent difficulty. He gave me a bracelet he'd made from woven creek grass, pressing it into my hand with a solemnity that made the gift feel more significant than any object I'd ever been given. His mother watched the exchange with the same expression I'd seen on her face when she'd thought her son might not survive the fall, but inverted somehow, full instead of empty. Rufus stopped at the boundary of their territory, a ridge above a drainage that I recognized from my early surveys. He put his hand on my shoulder. I put my hand on his forearm. We stood like that for a moment that I will carry for the rest of my life. Then he turned and walked back into the forest, and I stood watching the space where he'd been, until there was nothing left to watch. It took me 2 days to walk out. A ranger on a routine patrol found me on a maintained trail in the early afternoon and called for extraction. They treated me well. They were relieved, genuinely, with the unguarded relief of people who'd expected to find remains and found a living person instead. I told them I'd gotten disoriented after a fall, survived on stream water and foraged food, made a series of navigation errors that compounded before I found my bearings. It was a plausible story. They accepted it because they wanted to. 6 months later, after the physical recovery and the formal debrief and the counseling appointments I attended consistently because I'd promised my sister I would, I went back. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I followed my memories precisely, found the ravine, pushed through the narrows, came out in the valley. It was empty. Not abandoned in the way of places that have been left, where the evidence of habitation remains even after the inhabitants are gone. Empty in the way of places that have been carefully, methodically, completely unmade. The domed structures had been taken apart and their components scattered. The fire ring had been disassembled, its stones returned to the creek bed. The racks, the paths, the middens, all of it gone. The leaf litter and soil raked into a surface indistinguishable from the valley floor around it. They had worked on this for days, at minimum, probably longer. They had erased themselves from this place with the same systematic thoroughness they'd applied to everything else. I stood in the empty valley for a long time. Then I walked back out. I wrote up my deer migration paper from the partial data I'd collected before everything changed. It was published in a mid-tier journal and received the modest readership that mid-tier journal publications typically receive. My career resumed on its previous trajectory. My sister and I have dinner every few weeks now. I sleep better than I used to. The woven grass bracelet is in the inside pocket of the field jacket I wore when I walked out. I don't keep it in a box. I keep it where I can put my hand on it without thinking about it, which I do, without thinking about it, more often than I could accurately count. Here is the thing I have not told anyone, and the reason I've chosen now, 5 years later, to tell it. Before I left the valley for the last time, before Rufus turned and walked away at the territory boundary, he held out his hand. Flat, palm up, the way you hold your hand when you're offering something. In his palm was my field notebook, the original, the one I'd believed was destroyed with the rest of my equipment on that first night. It was intact. The pages were slightly water damaged, and one corner had been chewed by something, but my data was there, my observations, my 5 days of pre-contact survey work, everything I'd written before my satellite communicator was smashed. He had kept it. For 6 months, he had kept it. I took it with both hands and turned it over slowly, and when I looked up at him to ask the question, I had no words or gestures adequate to ask. He was already doing the head tilt, left, center, left, looking at the notebook in my hands with an expression I have spent 5 years trying to classify correctly. Not satisfaction, not pride, something closer to relief. Like he'd been holding something for me that he was glad to return. Like he'd understood from the beginning what it was for. I submitted the deer migration paper. I did not submit any of the other observations I made over those 6 months. The notebook is in a fireproof box in my home office. I tell myself I'm protecting them, keeping my promise, maintaining the secrecy that keeps them safe. I tell myself this, and mostly I believe it. But there is a question I can't stop asking in the part of my mind that stayed in that valley, the part of me that cleaned fish at the creek and rebuilt walls with gray mud and sat beside Rufus in the empty morning while the settlement woke around us. The question is this: the technological equipment, every camera, every GPS unit, every communicator, all of it was destroyed immediately and systematically. They'd done this before. They had a protocol for it. But the notebook, the handwritten paper notebook full of the observations of a field biologist doing his job, recording what he saw in a wilderness he'd come to study, they kept that. They kept the record of what I'd seen. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if it's a coincidence or a message or something I don't have a category for yet. The same way I didn't have a category for that first arrangement of bent cedar trees, or for the hand in the trail camera frame, or for a species that has chosen invisibility so completely that the entire apparatus of modern science has spent a century failing to confirm their existence. I don't know. But I have the notebook, and it has their story in it alongside mine, and every year, when I sit down to decide what to do with it, I close it and put it back in the box. Someday I'll open it again, and I'll know what the right answer is. I hope I'll know. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me when I first put it together, consider subscribing. There are more accounts like this one. People who went into places they weren't supposed to go and came back changed in ways they can't fully explain. Not all of them are comfortable stories. Not all of them end with a bracelet and an unanswered question. Some of them end in ways that will make you genuinely angry, and I think you should hear those too. And if you have a thought about what Rufus understood that Jake didn't, or about what should be done with that notebook, leave it in the comments. I read every one. That conversation, the one happening in the comments right now, between people who felt something when they read this, is part of why I keep making these. Don't leave without being part of it.